Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello. Today, unusually, we're going to talk about one of Transform Justice's own projects, Courtwatch London. We advertised for people interested in observing magistrates' courts, supported them to do it, and have analysed what they found. Rob Allen is with me to discuss the project, as is Becky Clarke, Senior Lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, who was on our advisory group, and Premila Trivedi, one of the court watchers. Rob, what struck you from reading our Courtwatch reports? You've actually written a foreword to the one that we've done, which focuses on young adult defendants. That's defendants who are aged 18 to 25.
Well, first of all, it's a great initiative to get ordinary members of the public to come in and see what's going on day to day in the magistrates' court and really test that against what's supposed to be happening. So in the case of young adults, they're supposed to be treated differently from older adults.
Differently how?
Well, lots of research now that people don't really achieve full developmental maturity till their mid-20s. So courts need to take that into account, speak to them differently, ensure they can participate. And the volunteers found that, yes, that happened in some cases, but most of the time not.
Sad to hear that. Premila, how did you find the experience of court watching?
Oh, it was completely fascinating. It gave me terrible headaches sometimes, but it was wonderful as well. I learnt so much. And every time I came away from a session, I had so many questions to ask.
Had you been in a criminal magistrates court before you joined the project?
No, never. I'd been to a play which was acted out in a court, but not the real thing.
And, I mean, a lot of people don't, but did you know that you could just walk straight in?
I had no idea you could do that. I thought that only special people could go. So it was a bit of a surprise that we were being encouraged to just walk in.
And, Becky, I spoke the other day to a big group of criminology undergraduates, and you teach undergraduates yourself. And of that big group of about 40, only 2 had visited a magistrate's court. It's a pretty hidden space, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's something we encourage our students to do. But it really does take some encouragement, some reassurance that it's okay for them to walk in. Also a little bit of kind of housekeeping support to say, if you're going to go in, turn your phones off. Even students who are engaging in studies around these issues often don't think it's a space that they can go into either.
Premila, you went to Croydon Magistrates Court, I think. Did you find it was kind of welcoming to you and to other volunteers?
I was quite nervous the first time I went because I didn't know at all really what to expect. We'd had training, but I think what Becky said was interesting because I think it does take a little bit of confidence to just walk in. And then when I walked in, you had to go through security, and that was a bit daunting, although I guess we're used to it now from museums and things. But it was okay at Croydon. They were not over-friendly, but I suppose when they're busy, But it was quite intimidating once you went through the security arch, and then you were suddenly confronted with 5 or 6 security people.
Did they ask you why you were there at all, or...?
No, not the security people, no.
Did anybody?
Yeah, in the court I was asked why I was there, and we were firmly told in training that we were allowed to go in there. We had every right to be there, and we didn't have to explain ourselves. I found as I went through more cases that actually it was easier to say we were from Courtwatch. Not the first couple of weeks. It seemed like everybody was getting their act together to understand what Courtwatch was. But it seemed once they knew we were court watchers, some people were very amenable, some were a bit kind of, oh, we don't care where you're from. If you can't hear, that's kind of your problem. It wasn't over-friendly. No, it probably wasn't friendly, actually.
Becky, do you think ordinary people who go into a court to watch what's going on, do you think that they should be asked why they're there?
I think there isn't a culture of openness in the courts. There isn't an expectation that people will come in and observe, and you are really pushing against quite a closed space in terms of just accessing the space and understanding where to be and what's happening. So I supported a small group of students through some internships last summer to do some court watching. And they went in a range of different courts across Manchester, and in every single one, they were questioned, there was some pushback, they were told not to take notes. So this idea that there is an openness to that space, I think, we've got a long way to go in lots of different ways to get to that point.
So Becky, Premila mentioned that we, Transform Justice, did training. We did a sort of half day of Magistrates Courts 101. Do you think that magistrates' courts are difficult to understand if you don't have some background beforehand? Do they explain within the courts how it works?
No, my students, one of the things we've asked them is, how have you made sense of what's happening there? I remember a student came back and she became really interested in all the things that are up on the walls in the building. And some of them were informative in some ways. So there was sort of a picture that she took on a phone and brought back from one of the sort of
Not
walls.
allowed, Becky, not allowed. Totally forbidden.
In the public space, so on the wall, a
forbidden,
picture. Really?
Forbidden, yeah.
Wow. So even that, a student being able to say, okay, there's this picture of who's in the courtroom and what they're doing. And she brought this back and said, okay, this is how I'm trying to make sense of what's happening in there. We were encouraged to go in there. Our mobile phones aren't removed or told to be turned off. So, this is concerning, isn't it? That we're encouraging folks to go in there and the sort of the principles and the rules and the expectations are not really very clear. I think as well for our students, there were real assumptions made by members of the court that they were part of cases or with families. There's a real clear sense of assumptions of who's who and who should be there and how people are interacted with in that space as well.
I think it was really interesting as well that I don't know whether the defendants are aware that actually any old person can walk in and watch, or their families, because I was very aware that, there were family members sitting next to me, and I had my Court Watch booklet and I was scribbling things down, and I don't blame them, if they were a bit suspicious as to who are you, why are you taking notes, this is my son or daughter. So I think there's something there that needs to be addressed as well, so the defendant and family members know.
I think it's a really important point, Premila, and one that our students brought back quite quickly from their experiences, that feeling that for defendants and their families, this can be an extremely difficult moment, and there's a sense of kind of voyeurism into that moment that is uncomfortable. In fact, one of our students came back and they began to develop what they called an ethics of care document. For them, a really important part of the experience of court watching was thinking about caring for each other, including for defendants and defendants' families. And, one of the practices that they adopted was that they would approach the defendants' families, if there were any there, which of course there weren't always, and just explain why they were there and almost offer the opportunity to say if they felt okay with it. So kind of like a loose process of consent. So I think that's really important that we think about how people going through that criminal legal process feel.
I really like that idea, Becky, of at least explaining who you are to the defendant's family. But I found that it was then quite difficult to not get involved in sort of taking the side of the defendant. I had one situation where a defendant's mother was in the public gallery, and she was quite vociferous, and she wasn't happy about having to stand up every time the judge came in. And she said, I'm not standing up for anybody, I'm as equal as he is. And so she would go out every time people had to stand up. On one occasion, she was outside and I went outside, and she started talking to me. We were talking about race, really. I couldn't quite work out where I was meant to be, whether I was meant to be neutral, because there was a sort of natural affinity with what she was saying, with what I quite often say. And I thought, I need to stop getting involved in this conversation.
Can I actually say I really agree with her? I think it's one of the habits of the court, which is there's no notice about it. And by the way, I used to be a magistrate myself. And there's this tradition that when the magistrates or the district judge comes into the court or leaves the court, the people in the public gallery and everybody else have to stand up, and then they can't sit down until the judge has sat down. To me, that belongs to a bygone society of kind of deference to these judges, which I just think is not relevant to today. And also, you don't see a notice about it anywhere. You just see it happening and you have to sort of follow the crowd. So I can understand your ambivalence about getting involved in that conversation, but the actual point she was making, I like.
I'm not so sure. I think there's a sort of lot of ritual going on in the court system, and that's probably one aspect of it. Can we move on a bit to the hearings themselves? I mean, we hear a lot, Premila, about backlogs in the courts. I mean, from what you saw, do you think the system was run efficiently or inefficiently?
If I'm honest, I have to say very inefficiently.
Very inefficiently?
Yeah. I mean, there was so much time wasted, either waiting for defendants to arrive, or I don't know what the delays were about half the time. But, you know, we spent an awful lot of time just hanging around in the court. And that was quite challenging. Obviously, we could get up and go to another court. But if your mobility isn't great, you know, I didn't want to keep dashing back and forth between courts. And also, I mean, all those people that were waiting, sometimes for 2 hours or more, I mean, it's ridiculous. All these people are being paid to do nothing, basically, except sit in the court and wait for people to come.
But did anybody sort of explain to you or anybody else why there was the delays or when it was going to start or anything like that?
Not sort of officially, but the lawyers would quite often, you know, if they were feeling friendly towards us, they'd just say, oh, God, this is just normal, you know, and it happens all the time. And that wasn't very reassuring, really. Yeah, it just seemed all a bit random, you know, which judge you were allocated. So quite often, if people were coming back, it would be a different judge or a different magistrate. And that felt very awkward because there was no sense of continuity. And I had one situation where the defendant had been seen by one judge, then they were seen by another judge when they came back. And the second judge was criticising the first judge, because the first judge had said, you know, the case needed to go to the Crown Court, and he didn't think it needed to. And then the first judge came back on the third time of seeing this guy. And I was quite shocked, actually, because I thought it was quite disrespectful of the second judge to be openly criticising. And also, when the first judge came back, she was very good, you know, she did sort it out. She get very kind of calm.
Becky, so you've done quite a bit of court watching in the Crown Court, as opposed to the magistrates. What do you think are the main differences? Obviously, well, presumably more serious cases for one thing, but is there a different feel to watching what's going on there?
I think there is. My work in the Crown Courts has largely been around cases where defendants are being prosecuted using joint enterprise, which I know you've had on a previous episode. There, the work is very much about trying to follow a full case and understand the ways in which different moments in the trial and practices may be contributing to particular outcomes for different defendants. So it's both a different space to experience, but perhaps also reflects that there are different possible purposes for court watching and that they're all important.
Yeah, can you give an example of a case where you or others have court watched in Manchester and what function that is performing?
Sure. My first experience of court watching was in 2017, and there'd been a young person killed in South Manchester, and a group of other young people had been charged with the murder.
All of them?
Yeah, well, initially it had been 12 young people, but one defendant, interestingly, the only female defendant and the only white defendant, was given no case to answer just at a pre-trial hearing. So there were 11 defendants that were taken into the trial. And I was very much going there in part as an advocate and supporting of families from the local community where there were concerns. I think also trying to make sense of how some of these practices and processes are playing out. But I think actually court watching and particularly note taking can become a really important resource for the appeal process. You know, defendants and their families are not only struggling to follow the process in real time, but then to be able to try and remember and reflect back on key moments that have happened in that trial that might be important in terms of supporting any legal challenge or appeal. So there's a range of functions. Some of them, they can be quite, human around advocacy, and others are quite practical, really, about recognising that when things go wrong in the system, it's very difficult for defendants and their families to make sense and move forward and challenge that.
You were talking about actually having evidence of what might have happened. I saw an example where the mother of one of the defendants was talking to the defence lawyer about a previous offence that her son had been jailed for, and she was insisting that she wanted a transcript of the previous trials. And I was quite shocked, actually, that there is no transcript of what happens in the magistrates' court, and that felt a bit strange to me. And then I started wondering, is there a kind of Ofsted that goes into magistrates' courts, and assesses what's going on?
The magistrates' courts are not recorded, there is no transcript, and therefore for the court watchers who went into the courts as part of our project, that is the only record, actually, of what went on there, apart from the actual kind of decision made. And it is weird that they are not recorded. So you were saying, Premila, that you saw different judges and magistrates in action. Looking at some people as you did again and again and being able to contrast, would you say that there's an absolute consistency of approach amongst judges?
No, and I really was getting upset at this, because I saw two district judges who were really excellent, I thought, who considered, the context of the defendant's crime and everything, and also were looking towards how can we help this person. And then I saw another, judge who was the complete opposite, just completely cold, just wanted to get through as quickly as possible, it seemed to me. And I don't know, there was no context. I mean, maybe that had been explored in a previous hearing, but I just thought you're meant to be innocent until you're proven guilty, and this is what the good judges seem to be kind of exploring. And I don't understand why.
Might have just been having a bad day. I mean, obviously judges shouldn't have a bad day, but maybe that was what it was.
Yeah, but, there's a cascade then, that he's having a bad day, and so he makes some decision about what's going to happen to this defendant, and then it cascades. And it's no wonder that the defendant might come back next time and say, well, actually, I'm going to go to the Crown Court, I don't want to be messing around here with the magistrates' court anymore. I don't know, I just think if you're a magistrate, you've got to have some kind of ability to communicate with people.
Or a district judge, for that matter.
Yeah, Yeah. And that was the other thing that really, really bugged me, that this poor guy, the defendant sitting in his box in the dock, and nobody is attempting to communicate with him. The lawyers are talking amongst themselves or with the judge, but they're not actually really talking to the defendant, except to say, do you understand? And so they usually end up saying, yeah, because, I just want to get out of here quick. I mean, the one example I saw of somebody really communicating was a translator who was really good and made sure that the defendant did understand what was going on. So there's, an important issue around translators, I think.
Mm. You talked a bit about the process there and maybe some shortcomings, but in terms of the decisions that the magistrates or the district judges reached, in your experience, do you think on the whole they seemed reasonable decisions, or did some surprise you?
They seemed reasonable when the judge actually took us through his process or her process of how they came to that decision. And that was really enlightening. For someone like me who's got no knowledge about the law, it would have been useful for the defendant, but not all the judges went through that process. And certainly the magistrates I saw just gave their decision but didn't really explain their thought process. And that really struck me, how important that process is.
Yeah, you mentioned a translator, which I'm guessing that was around language, and maybe that English wasn't the first language of the defendant. But if we sort of extend that concept of understanding and really think about what does it take for somebody to be an effective participator in the process of justice that they are being subject to. And my most recent court watching is a trial that I've been and sat in just over the last couple of weeks in Manchester Crown Court. Sadly, another joint enterprise trial that's currently ongoing. But those defendants are all children. In fact, 2 of them have turned 18 during the process of the criminal trial. And there was a discussion about whether they should have intermediaries to explain to them what's happening in the process. There was sort of just an assumption that, well, it would be too much to provide them with intermediaries throughout. So maybe just when they're giving evidence or just at this moment. And it's deeply shocking to think that people are almost being churned through this system and they don't really have a sense of what is happening to them. And I think it's a real challenge to the concept of a due process in justice if the defendants are not able to understand or participate effectively. And that's such a big finding within the report. And as I say, we can see it in other spaces as well.
Yeah, I mean, Premila, in terms of different types of defendants, did you think that some of them would or should be treated differently, maybe young people, people from minorities, for example, and how did that pan out in reality?
Well, I went into Court Watch all guns blazing, that there was going to be a big racial divide, and institutionalised racism throughout the whole system and everything. I'm sure that is there, but I was quite surprised at how much class seemed to play a part in the decisions that were being made by some judges. There was a woman who was at university, she had some mental health problems, but very smart and clean and everything. And she was treated quite differently from another woman who also had mental health problems, but, she was homeless and she was also sort of not working in things. And that kind of made me really think how important class is. And I wasn't surprised, really, because I know class is a big issue, but it's not one of the protected characteristics in the Equality Act, I don't think. And so it just makes a farce, really.
Becky, what do you think about that?
Well, I think the court space absolutely is a microcosm of those kind of class dynamics and politics of society. I mean, less than 10% of recorded crimes are prosecuted. So those cases that end up in the system, have already been sort of sifted through, and I'm sure class and other issues, are a part to play in that. As I was listening to you, Premila, I really thought about credibility, kind of who is viewed as credible in that space and therefore deserving of an interaction that is fair, respectful, clear, and all those other things that we'd like to think, and who kind of is not deserving of those things. You know, that court space really does have that deep sense of judgment, you know, and I think it is classed. I think it is racialised. I mean, as a court watcher, you're immediately attuned to it, and you're trying to find a way to make sense of it. You know, I've got a colleague who I do a lot of my work with, and as a black man, he said, Becky, I can't come in and court watch in these joint enterprise trials. He said it's too much like a kind of a historic experience of lynching, where there's all these people theatrically performing in wigs and robes, all white people, all largely upper class in the centre, and you've got 10 young black children in the dock. And I think, again, it's an important thing to think through about court watching, that it does make us feel, it makes us think about our society. And I think that we go into the courtroom with our expectations, our biases. Everybody else is in the courtroom and people's subjective feelings are playing out. And I think it's one of the things we were interested with the students, was trying to recognise the value of kind of gathering consistent data or information, but also thinking that Court Watch is about potentially humanising a space that seeks to dehumanise people sometimes. And, you know, how do we do that in a way that is caring, that is reflexive, so we recognise the assumptions and biases and judgments that we're doing. So I think it starts to introduce the complexities, and I think lots of the reasons why the work is so important to Court Watch.
I really agree with you there. I had some criticisms of the booklet we had to fill in, but one of the brilliant things was we did have this reflective space, which was completely open. And initially, I found it quite challenging because I was feeling the emotional side of things. You know, I knew I was there to collect facts, and that was straightforward, but I didn't realise that I would also feel. And so I think having that space and sort of going back to the Court Watch people and getting, yeah, that's fine, you know, just tell us what you think, because that's what this is all about. So it didn't have to just be pure fact. You know, we could say, this made me feel. And I think for me, as somebody who was court watching, that was important. I needed somewhere to offload, because it is a bit traumatic sometimes when you're hearing, you know, things.
Well, we watch power play out, but we feel quite powerless in that space. And I think it's natural to have a sort of a human reaction to that. And I think having an understanding of the project, you know, worked really hard to think through how you prepare, how you debrief. And I think it's a really important thing for anybody who's going to engage in court watching to think about, you know, that sort of wider way in which you are able to take care of yourself as you do that work.
I mean, Becky, you've told us that your court watching has kind of focused to an extent on these joint enterprise cases. Are those the main issues that you've been looking at, or are there other ones as well?
The function or the driver that took me into that space was to make sense of how that racist injustice happens in the court. But interestingly, I find myself really just thinking about more the nuts and bolts of the process, really thinking, you know, these processes are not really meeting mine or our, I suppose, the public's expectations about what is a due process of justice, but also they are kind of producing harms along the way as well.
I'm quite concerned as well that what impact is having cuts in mental health services, having cuts in probation services. I mean, those people, you know, are having to take on so many cases, and I can't make sense of the system where you commit a crime, the next day you're in the magistrates' court, and obviously there hasn't been time to get all the reports that the magistrates need to make a decision. And so you get sent away, then you come back. Getting that information sometimes seems to be quite difficult for people. And it really worries me that, you know, cuts in services like that really impact and then sort of have a escalating effect on what happens in the courts. And I think there's a whole societal thing that needs to be looked at as to how to make the system better. And maybe it is looking wider than looking at the criminal justice system.
I mean, perhaps that's a good note to end on. Sadly, we can't go wider today. We try and finish these podcasts by asking each of our guests to suggest one thing they would do if they had the power to try and improve what we've been discussing. So in this case, Premila, let's start with you. What would you do to encourage people to observe their local magistrates' court?
Coming from a community perspective, I think, first of all, let people know that this is something that you're allowed to do, you should do, and why it's important. You know, you're not just going there as a voyeur, you're going there because it's contributing to justice and it could contribute to a fairer world. And then hold some really good community events to let people know, and not just confine it to the big community organisations. Lots of little community organisations out there.
Okay, thanks. Becky, what about you?
Well, I love that idea, Premila, the idea that we're all responsible. I think if I was to go perhaps further into the system, addressing that imbalance of power, of that ability to engage and understand. And I really do think that the courts have a responsibility to provide some sort of record and transcripts, because those are the only ways that that real kind of acknowledgement and accountability can happen as and when things go wrong, which they do.
Great. And Rob?
Well, I think those are great ideas. I agree with both of them. I'd add one which is perhaps slightly not answering the question. There used to be something called a court inspectorate, so there was some scrutiny of magistrates' courts, but that inspectorate, I think, was scrapped about 15 years ago, so there isn't any formal mechanism for checking that what's happening in our courts is as it should be, and I'd like to see that brought back.
Great. Thanks, Rob, Premila and Becky. The 3 Court Watch reports and links to Becky's works are in our programme notes. Also, do sign up if you're interested in being a court watcher in future. We hope to be recruiting in a few months. Bye till the next podcast.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.